I am standing in the ICU listening to the steady hiss of my wife's ventilator. I called my daughter, desperately asking her to come and help, but she only replied, "I'm busy. Don't make a big deal out of it." I simply answered, "All right." I discovered that my daughter had betrayed me. The next day, I cut off all contact with her and signed one signature. After that, there were 42 missed calls from her, but I did not answer. Before I tell you what happened after those 42 missed calls, tell me where you're watching from and what the weather is like where you are right now. Like and subscribe to follow this journey. Note, this is a fictional story with dramatized elements for deeper, meaningful impact. The smell of hospital-grade disinfectant usually suggests cleanliness, but at 9:47 p.m. in the Charlotte General ICU, it smells like a slow-motion car wreck and the end of my 40-year marriage. I sat there, Vance Sinclair, a 65-year-old retired bridge inspector, with eyes that have seen every structural crack in the state, staring at the double doors where they had taken Adeline. For 4 decades, my job was to find the rust in the steel and the rot in the concrete before the weight of the world brought the whole thing down. I never once thought to point my flashlight at the foundation of my own home. My hands felt like lead in my lap, heavy and useless. Adeline had been driving down Highway 74, a route we had taken 1,000 times, when the brakes on her sedan simply ceased to exist. The doctors called it a miracle that she was alive at all, but as I listened to the rhythmic hiss of the hospital ventilation, I felt only a crushing, hollow guilt. I should have been the one in that car. I should have heard the squeal of the pads or felt the softness in the pedal. Instead, I was at the hardware store buying mulch while my wife was careening toward a concrete pylon. It was a structural failure I should have predicted. But even more disturbing than the mechanical collapse was the silence from my own blood. I looked at my phone again. No missed calls, no texts. Eloise Sinclair Madden, our 34-year-old daughter who runs a high-end design firm and always has her phone glued to her palm, was missing in action. She was choosing to stay away, while her mother's chest was being cracked open by a surgical team. Have you ever felt a bridge give way beneath your feet? It is not the falling that kills you. It is the realization that what you trusted to be solid was actually made of dust. I hit the call button for the 4th time, my thumb trembling against the glass. This time the line clicked open. There was no warmth, no frantic questions about her mother's vitals. Just the sound of a distant party and a heavy, exasperated sigh. "Dad, I told you I am exhausted," she said, her voice sounding like a sheet of ice. "I am in the middle of something important, and I really do not need the drama right now. I'll check in tomorrow if I have time. Good night." Before I could tell her that Adeline might not see the sunrise, the line went dead. I stared at the screen, a cold lump of betrayal forming in my gut that no doctor could cut out. Nurse Joyce, a woman with weary eyes and a soft voice that suggested she had delivered too much bad news in her 40 years of service, approached me with a clipboard. "Mr. Sinclair, I am so sorry to interrupt, but we need to process the $15,000 surgical deposit for the neuro rehab transfer." I nodded, reaching for my wallet. I pulled out my primary credit card, the one I had used for every major purchase for 20 years. Declined. A simple word on a tiny screen. It was not just a card. It was my entire life's safety net. I tried my backup card with a forced smile. Declined. "That is impossible," I told her, my voice cracking. "There is over 50,000 in that line of credit alone." I looked at the nurse's pitying face and then down at my phone. If my credit was gone, where was the 300,000 I had set aside for our retirement? The buzzing in my ears drowned out the hospital intercom, a high-pitched whine that sounded exactly like the sirens I'd heard screaming down Highway 74 just 6 hours ago. I fumbled with my phone, my thumb slipping against the glass as I tried to log into my bank app, while Nurse Joyce watched me with a pained, patient expression. The $300,000 retirement fund should have been there, a solid bedrock I'd spent 40 years pouring into our future. But the screen just kept spinning, mocking my desperation. My mind began to fracture, slipping backward through the timeline to the moment the foundation first cracked. I was sitting in my home office putting the finishing touches on a safety report for the Catawba River Bridge when the phone rang. Mr. Sinclair. It was a voice from the highway patrol, flat and professional. There has been an accident. Highway 74 near the overpass. The officer described a horrific single-vehicle crash involving a silver sedan. I remember the air leaving my lungs. Is she alive? I had gasped, the room spinning as the life I knew began to cave in. They told me she was being airlifted, mentioning a probable brake failure that had sent her through the guardrail. Memory is a funny thing. It doesn't come back as a story. It comes back as the smell of burning rubber and the taste of copper in the back of your throat. I recall the drive to the hospital, passing the crash site under the strobe of emergency lights. As a bridge inspector, I am trained to see the structural truth behind a collapse. I slowed just enough to see the debris field and the skid marks, or rather the lack of them. The steel shouldn't have twisted like that if she'd had any chance to slow down. Something felt wrong, a jagged edge in the narrative of a mechanical fluke. I'd given Eloise $2,000 in cash just last Tuesday. I told her the brakes were squealing and asked her to take the car to her preferred mechanic while I was out on a site visit. She'd called me that evening, her voice airy and confident, telling me it was all taken care of. New pads, new rotors, good as new. But the evidence on the asphalt suggested the pads had been non-existent. Do you know what it's like to realize you've been handing a wolf the keys to your sheepfold? The realization doesn't hit you all at once. It bleeds in. When I finally burst into the ER, I saw Adeline Sinclair, 63, lying beneath the pale blue hospital sheets. She was a retired librarian who always believed life followed a fair Dewey Decimal System. But now her life was being measured in the erratic peaks of a heart monitor. Dr. Leandros, a neurosurgeon with a face as sharp and precise as the scalpels he carried, stepped out of the trauma bay with blood on his scrubs. She has a massive subdural hematoma, Vance. We're going in now. I stood there paralyzed as the orderlies began to wheel her toward the elevators. I reached out, grabbing her bag to keep it safe, and her phone vibrated inside the side pocket. I pulled it out, my eyes blurring as I saw a message from Eloise sent an hour before the crash. Don't worry about the car, Mom. It's safe now. I stared at that text. It's safe now, as the elevator doors hissed shut on my wife. Safe or silenced. My hands started to shake, and it wasn't from the cold hospital air. Grief is supposed to be heavy, but betrayal is cold. So cold it makes your teeth ache in a room that's already freezing. I stood in the ICU hallway, clutching Adeline's phone, as if it were the only tether I had left to the woman who was currently being stitched back together behind heavy steel doors. My hands were still shaking, not from the climate control, but from the text I had just read. Safe. The word felt like a jagged piece of metal in my throat. I looked at the screen again, and my thumb hovered over Eloise's contact. I needed to hear her voice, needed her to explain why she would lie about the brakes. But as I went to call, the screen flashed with an incoming message. I am currently unavailable. Please contact my assistant for scheduling. It was an automated do not disturb reply. My own daughter had screened her mother's phone, placing a digital barrier between us, while Adeline's life hung by a surgical thread. It was 11 p.m. when I finally forced the line through calling, until the automated system broke. When Eloise finally answered, there was no fear in her voice, only a sharp, clinical irritation. Dad, I told you I have a designer showcase at 8 in the morning. She said, the words coming out clipped and professional. I've already had a long day, and I can't sacrifice my sleep for this overdramatic situation. It's not my problem right now. Good night. I stood there stunned into a silence so profound I could hear the hum of the floor buffers 3 units away. Eloise, she's your mother. I managed to choke out. She's bleeding in her brain, but the line was already dead. Have you ever sat in a room full of people and felt like the only person left on earth? It's a silence that screams. By 2 a.m., the surgeon finally emerged to tell me Adeline was stable but comatose. I sat in a hard plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room, trying to steady my breathing. I whispered to the empty room. Just one more bridge to cross, Addie. We have the money. We're safe. I needed to believe that, needed to feel the weight of the $300,000 I'd spent 40 years securing. I pulled out my phone to check the bank app, planning to figure out why the cards were declined so I could settle the surgical deposit. I logged in, my eyes stinging from the blue light. The screen loaded slowly, the little circle spinning like a draining sink. When the numbers finally appeared, my heart stopped. The primary savings account, the bedrock of our retirement, showed exactly $8,100. I refreshed it. Then I refreshed it again. Zero. That's the shape of my future. A perfect, hollow circle. The investment portfolio was a ghost town of empty line items. The checking account sat at a measly $3,000. I scrolled down, my vision blurring as I looked at the transaction history. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a structural warning of a total collapse. Where did it go? Where did it all go? I traced the lines of the most recent withdrawals, my finger trembling against the glass. The largest transfer, a six-figure drain, had occurred at 9:00 p.m. tonight, while I was begging the doctors to save Adeline's life. The recipient's name wasn't a stranger or a hacker. The name on the transfer was Sinclair Madden Designs. My daughter hadn't just abandoned us. She was actively looting the body before it was even cold. I watched the dawn light crawl across the linoleum floor, like a slow-moving liquid, counting the seconds, until 8 a.m., when the ghosts in my bank account would have to answer for themselves. The hospital air felt thinner now, stripped of the temporary insulation that shock provides. My daughter had not just abandoned us. She had systematically dismantled the walls of the life Adeline and I had spent 4 decades building. At 8:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Maria, a senior fraud investigator, with a voice as clipped and efficient as a ledger sheet, spoke to me from the bank's headquarters. She sounded cautious. Her words measured with the kind of professional distance that precedes a catastrophic report. Mr. Sinclair, we noticed a sequence of wire transfers over the last 18 months, she said. They were authorized under the durable power of attorney submitted in August of last year. A cold sweat broke across my neck. August, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I haven't stepped foot in a bank with my daughter since 3 years ago. Maria cleared her throat. The records show the email address on the account was changed 18 months ago to an address I'd never seen, v.sinclair.records@gmail.com. It explained the silence, the lack of digital alerts, and why I never saw the digital paper trail as our life's work was funneled into an account registered to Sinclair Madden Designs. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to lean against the cold hospital wall. She didn't just take the money. She took my name. While I was on the line, Maria emailed me the PDF of the power of attorney. I opened it on my phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the pages. I saw my own name, my address, and a signature that looked hauntingly like my own, yet lacked the slight tremor I've developed in my 60s. A forged signature is like a hairline crack in a bridge's support beam. To a stranger, it looks solid. To an inspector like me, it's the sound of everything coming down. It wasn't just a scribble. It was a masterpiece of deception. I was interrupted by the surgical resident, a young man named Dr. Aris, whose white coat still held the crisp creases of someone who hadn't yet seen a family implode, waited for my answer with a clipboard in hand. We need to discuss the facility transfer, Mr. Sinclair, he said, his eyes scanning his charts. The specialized neuro rehab center requires a $15,000 deposit to secure a bed. Adeline's survival now depended on money I no longer possessed because of my own flesh and blood. How do you tell a doctor that you can't save your wife because your daughter decided she needed a new office floor more than her mother needed to breathe? I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I'm having some issues with my accounts. I said the lie, feeling like ash in my mouth. Give me until this afternoon to coordinate the wire. Doctor. Aris nodded, though a flicker of concern crossed his face before he walked away toward the ICU. As the resident walked away, my phone pinged. A notification from the hospital's security gate app, a small detail Adeline had insisted on for my safety. A white Tesla had just pulled into the VIP lot. Eloise was here, and she was driving the car my retirement had paid for. The elevator indicator lights began their slow, rhythmic climb toward my floor. The elevator doors didn't just open. They slid apart with a hiss that sounded like a predator exhaling, revealing my daughter draped in $3,000 of Italian wool. I watched the numerical display go dark as she stepped out into the ICU waiting area, her heels clicking against the linoleum with a rhythm that felt like a hammer striking a nail. Eloise Sinclair Madden didn't look for me at first. Instead, she paused at the glass partition, checking the tilt of her jaw and the smoothness of her hair in the reflection. She looked perfectly composed, carrying a high-end designer coffee that perfumed the air with roasted beans and expensive cream, a scent that clashed violently with the sharp, clinical smell of antiseptic and dying hope. When she finally turned to me, she offered a superficial hug that felt less like a greeting and more like a business transaction. God, this place is so bleak. Dad, she said, pulling back to smooth her coat. How do you stand the lighting? It is doing terrible things to everyone's skin. I looked at her, my daughter, and felt a chasm opening between us that no amount of shared history could bridge. Your mother is in a coma, Eloise. I replied, my voice sounding like gravel under a boot. The lighting is the least of our concerns. I pulled her aside away from the nurse's station, my fingers twitching with a simmering rage I had to keep under lock and key. I checked the accounts this morning, I said, leaning in so only she could hear. I saw the transfers. Sinclair Madden Designs has our entire retirement fund. I have $15,000 due this afternoon for your mother's specialized neuro rehab transfer. I need that money back. I watched her eyes. I looked for a flicker of shame, a stutter in her heartbeat, anything to show she was still the girl I'd raised. I found nothing but cold, calculated annoyance. Not my problem. 3 words that dismantled 34 years of fatherhood in a single breath. I told you on the phone, Dad. I have overhead payroll and a massive new expansion in the South End. My liquidity is tight right now. Whatever you did with your financial mismanagement is not my responsibility. My breath hitched as she accidentally let it slip that she already knew the exact amount of the rehab deposit before I had even finished my sentence. She was monitoring the hospital's billing. She was watching us through the digital cracks she'd created with that forged power of attorney. At what point does a child stop being a daughter and start being a scavenger? Is it when the heart stops? Or just when the bank account hits 5 figures? She checked her gold watch, the one I'd bought her for her 30th birthday, and sighed. I have a tasting with a client in 20 minutes. Don't be so dramatic. If she's meant to wake up, she will. We should just wait and see before throwing good money after bad. Call me if anything permanent happens. She turned on her heel and headed back toward the elevators. As she walked away, the flap of her designer tote shifted, revealing a flash of a blue legal folder. My eyes locked on the bold text sticking out, petition for involuntary guardianship. I saw my name printed in block letters. I watched the white Tesla pull out of the lot from the window, but my eyes were fixed on the ghost of that blue folder. She wasn't just waiting for her mother to die. She was already preparing to bury me alive in a state-run facility. My fingers shook so hard, I nearly dropped my phone onto the pavement, the last piece of technology I actually owned that hadn't been compromised by my own blood. I sat on a cold stone bench outside the hospital entrance, the evening shadows stretching long across the concrete like grasping fingers. I couldn't breathe. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that blue folder in Eloise's bag. Guardianship. It was a death sentence for a man who had built his life on independence. I scrolled through my contacts, skipping past the names of people who were just associates or neighbors, and finally tapped the one that had been there for 40 years. Basil the First whispered, when the line connected, my voice breaking in the cool air. She took it all. She took everything, and she is just waiting for Adeline to die. I told him about the declined cards and the cold, polished glass of my daughter's eyes. Basil Redmond, 72, arrived at the hospital with a thermos of black coffee and a heavy envelope of cash, the retired hardware store owner's grip, as firm as it was 40 years ago. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me that everything was going to be all right. Instead, he sat next to me and looked me square in the eye. "Stay right there, Vance," he had told me on the phone. "Don't say another word to her. I am 20 minutes out." He mentioned something that made the hair on my arms stand up. He'd seen Beckett Madden lurking around my house 3 weeks ago, long before the accident. The surveillance hadn't started yesterday. It was a planned invasion. Do you have that one friend, the one who doesn't tell you it's going to be okay, but instead gives you the shovel you need to bury your enemies? That was Basil. He led me into the hospital cafeteria, the smell of burnt coffee and floor wax thick in the air. He pushed a heavy, unmarked envelope across the table. "This isn't a loan, Vance. This is a war chest. Go pay that nurse so they don't move Adeline an inch." I looked inside and felt a weight pull at my chest. $20,000. It was heavier than the steel I'd inspected all my life. It was the weight of a second chance. I tried to push it back, telling him it was his entire emergency fund, his floor-safe stash. He just glared at me with that old merchant's fire. "Stop it. Use it, then start thinking." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You have spent 40 years finding the rust in the steel, Vance. Why are you letting your daughter hide the rot in your own house? Stop crying and start documenting. Every cent, every text, every lie. You need to look at this like an inspector, not a father." He told me he'd seen Eloise taking a large box of old files out of my workshop the night before the crash. She hadn't just stolen the money. She had cleared out the evidence. I gripped the envelope, the paper crinkling under my knuckles. Basil was right. I was done being a victim. I was going home to conduct the most important safety audit of my life. And God help Eloise if I found what I thought was missing. The grief was still there, a dull ache beneath my ribs. But for the first time since the brakes failed on Highway 74, it was being crowded out by something sharper, something unyielding. The front porch light flickered as I shoved my key into the lock, a rhythmic stutter that felt like a dying pulse in the house I'd called home for 30 years. I stood there for a moment, in the humid North Carolina twilight, the heavy envelope of Basil's cash pressed against my ribs like a protective plate of armor. I'd spent 40 years inspecting the integrity of steel spans. Yet as I stepped across the threshold, I realized I'd let the foundation of my own life be eaten away by rust I refused to see. The house didn't smell like Adeline's lavender sachets anymore. It smelled of stale air and a cloying, expensive perfume that didn't belong to my wife. I moved through the foyer, my internal sensors screaming. A stack of mail on the console had been shifted 3 inches to the left. The fine layer of dust on my antique roll-top desk had been disturbed by fingers much smaller than mine. I whispered to the walls, "What did you let her take?" I pulled out my phone and checked the security app, only to find the last 48 hours of footage was missing. The system had been remotely disabled from an IP address I recognized as belonging to Sinclair Madden Designs on the very night of the accident. The sanctuary was breached. I marched toward my home office, the clinical detachment of a bridge inspector taking over. I went straight for the lateral file cabinet behind my collection of structural engineering manuals. Behind a false back I'd installed decades ago, I found a manila folder that shouldn't have existed. Inside were the closing documents for a $95,000 home equity line of credit. My hands stayed steady, but my stomach turned to lead. The signature at the bottom was a hauntingly accurate mimicry of my own cursive paired with a notary stamp from Marcus Webb, a name I'd seen on dozens of Eloise's business contracts. 95,000. She didn't just take the cash. She took the roof over our heads. Have you ever looked at your own handwriting and realized it belonged to a stranger? It's like looking in a mirror and seeing someone else's eyes staring back. Further back in the drawer, I found a stash of return-to-sender stickers and bank notices that had clearly been intercepted before I ever saw the mailbox. There were practice sheets, dozens of them, where my own daughter had spent hours perfecting the slant of my V and the loop of my S. She wasn't just my daughter. She was a ghost in my machine, a parasite that had been living in the shadows of my office for over a year. Looted. My life wasn't a legacy to her. It was a liquidation sale. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me, the kind that comes when you finally locate the fracture point in a condemned structure. I reached for a thick 1980s safety manual on the top shelf, and as I tilted it, a glossy brochure fell out. It was for a private nursing home called Sunset Pines. Tucked inside was a draft of a letter from Eloise inquiring about immediate placement for 2 residents under involuntary guardianship. I turned the page of the nursing home brochure and saw the price list for memory care unit secured. She didn't want my money. She wanted me erased. And then my eyes fell on a folder I'd missed. A folder labeled simply Adeline's Policy. I didn't just open the files. I performed an autopsy on my own bank account, following the blood trail of my life savings into the cold belly of Eloise's high-end lifestyle. My hands, usually steady from a lifetime of measuring steel tolerances, only stopped shaking once the first spreadsheet loaded on my monitor. I sat there in the pale glow of the screen, mapping out 18 months of systematic extraction. It was an engineering project of greed. I found the first major puncture wound, $120,000 funneled directly toward the down payment for her Charlotte luxury condo. Another $65,000 had been paid in a lump sum to Tesla. As I pulled up her firm's promotional videos on my second monitor, I watched her glide through a kitchen with marble countertops that I now realized were carved out of my 2030 pension. Every success she had touted at our Sunday dinners, every award and expansion, had been funded by the sweat and safety checks of my entire career. I found a photo on her public design blog posted the morning of the accident. She was at a champagne brunch celebration, smiling at the camera while I was being told the brakes had failed on Highway 74. Trying to track Eloise's greed was like trying to map a termite infestation. By the time you see the hole, the structure is already gone. I dug deeper into the digital shadows and found the ghost payroll. Beckett Madden, my son-in-law, had been receiving consulting fees of $5,000 a month, pulled directly from my stolen equity line. He wasn't just a bystander. He was the bookkeeper for the betrayal. Every holiday gift and polite thank you card from that couple over the last year had been bought with my own hijacked labor. I whispered to the empty office, "Beckett, you spineless coward. You were on my payroll without me even knowing." The transaction history showed that his consulting fees were immediately transferred to accounts linked to underground offshore betting sites. He had a debt, and Eloise had a way to pay it, provided he kept his mouth shut about the rot. Would you look for a motive in a child's eyes, or would you just look at the receipts? I chose the receipts. They don't lie like daughters do. Then I found the fatal deadline. There was an urgent failed transfer attempt from the day before the crash. Eloise had tried to move $150,000 for a commercial lease deposit in the South End, a deal that was being rescinded in 48 hours. The bank had finally flagged it, requiring a second verbal authorization from me that she couldn't forge over a keyboard. She was racing against a clock, and Adeline's life was the only obstacle between her and the final security check. The accident wasn't a tragedy. It was a desperate attempt to bypass the bank by making herself the sole beneficiary of our estate. As the printer spat out the final evidence of the $408,000 theft, my eyes drifted back to that Adeline's policy folder resting on the edge of the desk. I hadn't opened it yet. I hadn't seen the forged signature that turned my wife's life into a $750,000 lottery ticket. My fingers felt like lead as I reached for the manila tab. I pulled the folder toward me, the manila cover feeling like lead, knowing that inside lay the price tag Eloise had placed on her mother's pulse. My desk lamp hummed in the midnight silence of the house, a solitary light illuminating the wreckage of a life I thought I knew. My fingers traced the edge of the paper as I opened the Adeline's policy folder, my lungs feeling as though they were filled with concrete. The first document was a change of beneficiary form for our primary $750,000 life insurance policy. It was dated November 18th, 2024. I stared at the lines where my name had been systematically removed and replaced by Eloise Sinclair Madden as the sole recipient. The notary stamp at the bottom was the same one used on the forged power of attorney. This wasn't an impulse born of a recent financial crisis. This was a year-long engineering project, a structural setup for a massive payday that required my wife to be a memory. $750,000. That's what a mother is worth to you, Eloise. I found a second secret policy beneath the first one taken out in Adeline's name without either of us ever being notified. The total value of her death was now well over $1 million. 3 weeks. That's how long she let her mother drive a ticking time bomb. Every morning she kissed her cheek and waited for the explosion. I turned my attention to a printout from a local mechanic's online portal I'd found tucked in the back. It listed an appointment for a full brake system replacement on Adeline's silver sedan, scheduled for August 13th, 2025. Right below it was the digital cancellation timestamp from only 3 hours later, initiated by a user ID linked to Eloise's business email. The weight of the $2,000 in cash I had given her felt like a physical burn in my pocket. I had paid for the repair. I gave her the money to keep Adeline safe, and she used it to sign her death warrant. She didn't just ignore the problem. She actively made sure the safety net was removed. How do you reconcile the daughter who used to hold your hand at the zoo with the woman who calculated the velocity needed for a fatal impact? You don't. You stop being a father, and you start being a witness. As a bridge inspector, I know that no skid marks on an accident report usually means the pilot never had a chance. I cross-referenced the cancellation with the Highway 74 police report. Eloise hadn't just hoped for an accident. She had engineered the failure knowing Adeline's daily route and the exact moment those thinned, metal-on-metal pads would finally give way on the descent near the overpass. This isn't theft anymore. This is a murder conspiracy. Hidden in the very back of the folder was a printout of a Google search history from her firm's computer. The phrases stared back at me in cold, digital ink. How to simulate brake failure and Charlotte General Hospital DNR policy. I looked at the DNR search result and felt my blood turn to slush. She wasn't just waiting for the accident. She had a plan for the hospital bed, too. I reached for my phone, my hand finally steady with an icy, unwavering resolve. It was time to call the one person who could turn this paper trail into a prison cell. I didn't walk into the law firm. I marched into it with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who spent 40 years ensuring bridges didn't collapse, carrying a briefcase that contained the wreckage of my own family. The glass doors of Caldwell and Associates were polished to a mirror finish, but they couldn't hide the cold, surgical focus I felt vibrating in my own bones. I was no longer just a husband or a father. I was an inspector arriving at a terminal failure site. Jennifer Caldwell, 40, an attorney with a sharp bob and a gaze that could dissect a witness at 50 paces, stood behind her desk with a look of professional concern. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I spread the blueprints of Eloise's theft across her mahogany desk. The forged HELOC, the drained retirement statements, and the life insurance beneficiary changes that turned my wife's heartbeat into a countdown for a payday. I watched Jennifer's professional mask slip as she realized the sheer scale of the calculated betrayal. She had seen children steal from their parents before, but she told me she had never seen a child plan their mother's funeral while the woman was still healthy enough to drive. I sat there unwavering and told her the truth she was already seeing. Eloise didn't just want the money, she wanted us gone. Detective West reveals that Eloise's business, Sinclair Madden Designs, was already under a quiet investigation for tax evasion, and my evidence was the final piece they needed to bring the whole structure down. Have you ever looked at a man whose job is to catch monsters and seen him flinch? That's when you know your own blood has crossed a line no one should ever touch. Detective Anthony West, 50, a man whose suit looked as tired as his eyes, but whose handshake held the weight of 20 years in the Financial Crimes Division, entered the room with a heavy notebook. He grew quiet as I presented the mechanical smoking gun, the logs showing Eloise had canceled the brake repairs I had already paid for. He looked at the search history for simulating brake failure and then back at me. "This isn't just a paper trail anymore, Vance," he whispered. "This is a crime scene with a pulse." We were moving beyond financial abuse and into the territory of attempted first-degree murder. The air in the room felt thick, pressurized like a deep-sea cable about to snap. West and Caldwell outlined the initial charges: elder financial abuse, 3 counts of forgery theft by swindle insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. 7 felonies. 1 for every year I spent teaching her how to ride a bike, how to drive, how to be a person. What a waste of a life. I picked up the pen to sign the formal complaint against my own daughter. "Once you sign this, Vance, there is no making it go away for a family dinner," West warned. "This is the state of North Carolina versus Eloise Sinclair Madden." I didn't hesitate. "My daughter died the moment she canceled those repairs," I told him, as the ink dried on the page. "I am just seeking justice for my wife." West noted that the notary who signed the forged documents was already flagged in a different fraud case, potentially linking Eloise to a larger criminal network. As I walked to my car, Detective West's last words echoed in my skull. "We're going to need a search warrant for her firm's server, Vance. There's a file on there she thinks is deleted, but we've already seen the ghost of it." The sound of my phone ringing as I pulled out of the parking lot was a sharp, digital intrusion that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel, the first of many calls that would change the course of the next 48 hours. Detective West didn't wait for a greeting. He told me to turn around and come back to the station immediately. "There is a specific kind of cold that doesn't come from the wind. It's the chill that settles in your marrow when you realize your only child has been shopping for your replacement life while you were still living it." I sat in the digital forensics lab, the air smelling of ozone and overworked cooling fans, as West showed me what they had found on the encrypted server. The tech team had bypassed a folder titled Final Transition. It was a blueprint for an erasure. West revealed a series of PDF documents that made the room feel like it was spinning a pre-filled guardianship petition for me, citing early-onset cognitive decline and a brochure for Sunset Pines. She had the psych evaluation forms partially filled out. Vance West said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. She just needed a doctor's signature, and she was already talking to one. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Early-onset decline. I am a bridge inspector. I notice things people miss every day. I am not the one losing my mind, but the plan was already in motion. Erased. Not dead, but gone. A ghost in a state-run facility while she toasted to her success in our dining room. I reviewed the spreadsheets found in that folder, and a wave of nausea washed over me. It was an inventory of my life, my specialized workshop tools, Adeline's rare first edition book collection, even the wedding china we'd used for 40 years. She had everything priced out for an estate sale. The plan showed that Eloise intended to move us into Sunset Pines within 48 hours of Adeline's unfortunate accident, while I was still too shell-shocked to resist the guardianship papers. I discovered that she had already listed our family home on a private pocket listing for investors with a closing date scheduled for just 10 days away. She didn't just want the house. She wanted to sell the memory of us. A home isn't just four walls. It's a structural support for the soul. Eloise was pulling the beams out one by one, waiting for the roof to crush us. I looked up Sunset Pines on my phone while West continued the briefing. The reviews were a horror story of neglect and locked wards. This place. It is a prison for the old, I whispered. She wanted to lock us away in a room with a view of a brick wall. West nodded grimly. She wanted to erase the evidence of where she came from, Vance. It is time to show her we are still here. The psych eval document wasn't just a draft. It had been falsified with a forged signature from a local clinic where Eloise did a design project, making the guardianship process look dangerously imminent. I looked at that forged report and felt a new kind of fear. She wasn't just stealing our money. She was setting a trap that would strip me of my legal right to even speak. And then West's phone buzzed with an incoming text from the lab. Vance, they just decrypted the private messages. You need to hear this. How long does it take for a father to become a stranger in the fluorescent hum of a digital forensics lab? I realized it takes exactly the amount of time it takes to read a price list for your own institutionalization. I stood in the lab processing the Sunset Pines documents, while Detective West worked on a second terminal, his keyboard clicking like a rapid-fire pulse. For decades, I had been the man people called to ensure structures could withstand the relentless pressure of time and gravity. I had inspected every bolt and cable of the most complex spans in the state, yet I had been completely blind to the rust eating through the foundation of my own home. I realized now that Eloise didn't just want the assets. She wasn't just after the house or the savings. She wanted to remove the witnesses of her past, so she could reinvent herself as a self-made success story. A woman who rose from nothing, instead of a woman who was carried on the shoulders of parents she eventually liquidated. She was trying to burn the blueprints of who I am. I said, my voice barely audible over the cooling fans. West paused, looking at me with a grim, knowing sympathy. We're seeing this more often, Vance. Predatory heirs don't want a family. They want a trust fund. They see people as obstacles to be managed or deleted. A conspiracy isn't a single explosion. It's thousands of tiny termites eating the floorboards until you fall through into the basement. I found a to-do list in the server files that made my stomach lurch. Cancel Adeline's supplemental insurance was checked off the day before the crash. She was ensuring the hospital bills would drain the estate even faster, leaving us even more vulnerable. West pointed out a recurring name in the final transition folder, Marcus Webb. I recognized it immediately. He was the corrupt notary who worked exclusively for the high-end real estate developers Eloise designed for. Marcus Webb. He is the one who stamped the haylock. I said, the clarity of the situation feeling like a sheet of ice. He has been on her payroll for years. West nodded, making a note. We'll pick him up too. Forgery at this level carries a mandatory minimum. He won't hold out long once he sees the paper trail we have. Recorded. She sat across from me at dinner months ago, passing the salt, and recording my stumbles like a hunter tracking a wounded deer. I discovered a hidden recording she'd made during a night where I'd forgotten a minor detail about a neighbor's name. It was labeled, Evidence of Cognitive Decline Guardianship. I looked at a family photo on my phone, one taken last Christmas. I saw the calculated, practiced smile on Eloise's face and realized she was likely checking the balance of our accounts while the shutter clicked. The Eloise I loved was a fictional character, a role she played until the payoff was high enough to drop the mask. The woman in these server files was a predator, a terminal flaw in the structure of my life that had to be addressed with the same clinical precision I used to condemn a failing bridge. I'm done being the father I told the empty air. From here on out, I'm just the lead witness. I closed the laptop and looked at West. The technicalities were over. The internal debate was dead. Play the decrypted messages, detective. Let's see just how deep this grave goes. The blue light of the monitor reflected off Detective West's glasses, turning his eyes into cold, digital voids as the first string of decrypted messages crawled across the screen. I watched the flickering text, my breath hitching in a chest that felt increasingly hollow. The screen of the forensics terminal hummed to life, revealing a scrolling log of private messages that stripped away the last of the illusions I held about my daughter. These were not the words of a child. They were the blueprints of a predator. I leaned in my hands, gripped so tightly on the edge of the desk that the plastic groaned. The logs from August 12th were the first to hit me. It was the day I had given Eloise $2,000 for the repairs. I read her message to Beckett. The squeal is loud, but the pads are thin enough. One more trip down the 74 should do it. I felt a numbing horror wash over me. The accident wasn't a gamble she'd hoped for. It was a calculated mechanical failure timed to a specific geographic incline. She knew. She heard those brakes screaming for help, and she just waited for the laws of physics to do her dirty work. It's right here, Vance West said, his voice dropping an octave as he pointed at the timestamps. One more trip. That is premeditation. The twist in my gut worsened as I saw that Beckett wasn't just a bystander. He was the one who physically called the shop to cancel the appointment at Eloise's direct request. Liability. My wife wasn't a woman to them. She was a line item on a spreadsheet that needed to be zeroed out. The log jumped to the night of the crash, September 4th. While I was pacing the waiting room in a cold sweat, praying for a miracle, Eloise was texting Beckett about DNR protocols and letting nature take its course. She argued that wasting liquid assets on long-term care for a depreciating liability was a poor business move. Depreciating liability. Is that what 34 years of motherly love gets you? She was coaching Beckett on how to convince me to sign the papers, Vance West whispered. How do you breathe when you realize the person you taught to walk was just waiting for you to fall so they could pick your pockets? The forensic hammer came down with a final message sent on. September 5th, shortly before she arrived at the hospital in that white Tesla. She told Beckett to keep the car in the garage and act stressed so I wouldn't suspect a thing. But the darkest part was her backup plan. She'd already looked into alternative home health accidents involving Adeline's medication if the brakes had held. We have enough, West said, standing up with an icy finality. This is attempted first-degree murder for financial gain. I looked at the scrolling evidence of a soul that had rotted long ago. Do it, I replied, my voice as hard as the steel I once inspected. Arrest them. Both of them. West closed the laptop and stood up. The light of the screen still burned into my retinas. Get some sleep, Vance, he said softly. The tactical team meets at 0500. By 0600, your daughter will be in handcuffs. I stood up, my joints feeling like rusted hinges, and walked out of the lab. The world was cold, but the path ahead was finally clear. The pre-dawn air in Charlotte was thick and humid, but as the first blue and red lights cut through the mist at 5:58 a.m., I felt a winter chill settle into my bones that no North Carolina summer could ever melt. I sat in the darkness of my parked sedan half a block away from the gleaming glass tower where my daughter slept in luxury bought with my sweat. I watched from the shadows as a tactical team in muted black gear moved with silent predatory precision toward the lobby of the condo complex. There were no sirens yet. I saw the muffled thud of a battering ram against a side entrance, a dull vibration that reached me through the pavement, followed shortly by the sharp, distant shattering of glass. It was a strange irony to sit there knowing I had paid for the very high-end security system the police were currently bypassing with a steel bar. I whispered to the dashboard structural failure Eloise. It always starts at the base. As the first floor was secured, the elevators were locked down, and I knew the team was climbing toward the penthouse. My hands were steady on the wheel, my mind performing a cold, mechanical audit of the collapse. I saw Eloise trying to play her last card when the officers reached her door. According to the radio chatter West had let me monitor, she actually tried to bribe the arresting officer with the very HELOC funds she had stolen from me, entirely unaware that the account had been frozen for hours. The arrogance of the move was the final structural crack. Orange. It was a far cry from the Italian wool she had worn yesterday, the color of a warning sign, the color of the end. By 6:15 a.m., the lobby doors swung open again. Eloise and Beckett were marched out into the humid morning in their silk pajamas, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. Eloise was screaming, her voice a shrill, jagged thing that cut through the quiet neighborhood. She was shouting about her lawyers and her reputation. Her face contorted in a narcissism that didn't recognize guilt, only the massive inconvenience of being caught. Beckett looked like a man who had finally seen the bridge he was standing on collapse into the river, his eyes vacant and his shoulders slumped. Vance, tell them. He shouted toward the street, his voice cracking. Tell them it's a mistake I stayed in the dark, my face a mask of granite. Seeing your child in handcuffs is like watching a building you spent 30 years designing get demolished in 30 seconds. You just stand there and breathe in the dust. Eloise spotted my car then, and for a heartbeat, her expression shifted. The rage vanished, replaced by a manipulative, childlike pleading I'd seen 1,000 times when she wanted a new toy or a later curfew. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I said nothing. The silence was the only thing I had left to give her. I watched as the officer pushed her head down into the back of the cruiser, the finality of the metal door slamming shut, serving as the period at the end of our relationship. As the police began to clear the scene, an officer walked over to my car and tapped on the glass. He held out a small evidence bag containing a gold band Adeline had worn for 40 years. Eloise had already listed it for sale on a luxury consignment site. She had been pawning our past while the blood was still wet on the highway. A house without a wife is lonely, but a house without the daughter you thought you raised is a hollowed-out shell echoing with the ghosts of every lie ever told over Sunday dinner. I stepped into the foyer of my home in Matthews, North Carolina, feeling the unnatural stillness of the air. The weight of Adeline's wedding ring was a small, cold gravity in my pocket, until I placed it gently on her bedside table right next to the hand lotion she used every night. I walked through the rooms, tracing the structural integrity of a family that I now realized had been riddled with dry rot for years. I had spent my career looking for fractures in steel and concrete, yet I had been a blind man in my own hallways. The childhood photos of Eloise on the mantel, the gap-toothed grins, the soccer trophies, the graduation gown no longer looked like milestones of growth. They looked like the early stages of a long con. I felt a sudden urge to check the foundation of the house itself. As I knelt in the kitchen to inspect the baseboards, I noticed a tiny black plastic tab adhered under the edge of the oak table. I pulled it free, realizing with a sick lurch that it was a high-sensitivity recording device. She hadn't just been stealing our money. She had been a squatter in our private conversations for months, listening to us while we ate our breakfast. You weren't just a daughter, I whispered to the empty chairs. You were a parasite. At 5:47 p.m., the landline began to chirp. It was a relic I kept only for emergencies, a hardwired connection to a world that didn't rely on cell towers. The caller ID display flashed with 4 words that made my blood turn to ice. Mecklenburg County Jail. Ring. A sound that used to mean a child was checking in. Now it is just the rhythmic clanging of a prison door. An automated voice informed me of a collect call from an inmate. Press 1 to accept, the recording droned. I sat in my mahogany armchair watching the phone vibrate against the end table. Not today, I thought, my hands resting steady on my knees. Not ever again. I let the silence return, but it was short-lived. The phone rang again 10 minutes later, then again at 6:15 p.m. By the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, the missed calls log showed 7 attempts. I pulled out a fresh notebook and began a tally, treating each vibration like a structural stress test. I noted the time of each ring with clinical precision. It became a morbid arithmetic of narcissism. 7 calls for money or legal help. 0 calls to the hospital to ask if her mother's heart rate was stable. A family is a bridge. When the cables snap, you don't try to tie them back together with string. You let the whole thing drop and you start over on higher ground. I was about to close the book when the 8th call came through. I looked at the digital readout and froze. This one wasn't from the jail's general line. It was a direct ping from a prepaid account linked to Beckett. I looked at the 7th call, the one from Beckett, and realized the cracks in their perfect marriage were wider than the ones they'd put in mine. He wasn't calling to apologize for the brake lines or the stolen equity. He was calling to sell her out before she could do the same to him. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in the ICU at 4 a.m., a heavy clinical quiet, where the only thing louder than the machines is the sound of a father's heart hardening into stone. I sat in the dimly lit room beside Adeline, watching the mechanical rhythm of her ventilator. The pale green light of the heart monitor cast long, flickering shadows against the sterile walls, making the room feel like a submersible deep underwater. I reached out and took Adeline's hand. It was cool, the skin like fine parchment. I realized that while I had spent 40 years ensuring the structural integrity of bridges across this state, I had been blind to the rot eating the foundation of my own home. "I'm fixing the foundation, Addie," I whispered to her comatose form. No more leaks. No more rot. I spent the quiet hours performing a structural purge of our legal lives. While reviewing the medical files I'd requested from the nursing station, a cold shock hit me. I discovered that Eloise had already tried to sign a comfort care-only waiver for Adeline 48 hours ago. If the hospital hadn't flagged the pending insurance dispute, she would have effectively stopped all life-saving treatment while I was at the hardware store. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was lethal. The night nurse, a man named Marcus with soft-soled shoes and a quiet efficiency that respected the gravity of the room, moved around the bed like a shadow. He checked the IV bag, the smell of rubbing alcohol and sterile plastic following him. I looked up and handed him the forms. "I need to remove my daughter from all medical decision-making roles," I said, my voice as flat and hard as a granite slab. Effective immediately. Marcus took the clipboard, his eyes reflecting a weary understanding. "I'll get the social worker to notarize the change at shift change, Mr. Sinclair." I watched him leave, then picked up my black pen. Delete. A 6-letter word that carries more weight than 1,000 apologies. One click, and 34 years of history become an empty folder. I struck through Eloise's name on every document, the ink bleeding into the paper like a final judgment. I listed Basil Redmond as the primary contact, feeling a literal weight lift from my chest as the legal tether to my daughter was severed. I opened my laptop, the blue light stinging my eyes. I began the digital exile, changing every password and removing Eloise from every shared account. I found a photo of her as my wallpaper, a picture from her graduation, where she looked so bright and promising. With a steady thumb, I selected delete. Pruning a family tree is messy work. You end up with sap on your hands and a hole where a branch used to be, but it is the only way to save the trunk. "You are not a Sinclair anymore," I muttered to the empty air. "You are just a case number." As I finished the final purge, I found an old handwritten emergency plan in Adeline's purse that she'd written years ago. Her shaky script from 3 years ago stated clearly that she never wanted Eloise to have control over her care. I looked at the note and realized I wasn't the only one she had been hiding things from. she knew. And as the sun began to rise over Charlotte, the hospital doors opened for my attorney with news of the arraignment. The oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a groan that sounded like a bridge cable snapping under too much tension. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't there to fix the break. I walked into the galley adjusting my tie with fingers that felt like cold iron. I had spent the night purging my daughter from every digital and legal corner of my life, but the physical reality of the courtroom was a different kind of audit. I took my seat in the front row, my back as straight as a support beam. A moment later, Eloise was led in through a side door. The designer poise I had seen her wear like armor only days ago was gone, replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that made her skin look sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her hair was a bird's nest, and her eyes were wild as she scanned the room. When she locked eyes with me, she immediately attempted a look of tearful innocence, her lip trembling in that rehearsed way she'd used since she was 6. I met her gaze with the clinical, unblinking focus of a bridge inspector assessing a condemned structure. I offered no comfort, no recognition. "Daddy, please," she mouthed the words, silent behind the glass partition. I whispered to the empty seat beside me where Adeline should have been sitting. "The inspection is over. Judge Miller." A man with silver hair and a reputation for being as unyielding as the granite of the courthouse steps looked down from the bench with zero patience for theatricality. Prosecutor Rachel, a woman who carried her case files like a loaded weapon, stood ready to dismantle the Sinclair Madden defense. She began reading the 7 felony counts, her voice echoing in the deathly silent room. The details of the final transition plan and the canceled brake repairs spilled out into the public record like toxic waste. Guilty. Not the verdict, but the weight of the air in the room. You could smell it on her stale fear and expensive perfume. Eloise's defense attorney tried to argue for a personal recognizance bond, citing her status in the community, but the floor fell out from under them mid-hearing. The attorney asked to be recused, stating that the retainers had been paid with stolen funds that the state had already clawed back. Is it possible to feel sorry for a wolf that finally got caught in the trap it set for its own pack? I looked for that pity in my chest and found only an empty, echoing hallway. Judge Miller leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "The state requests a high bond, and this court agrees. Bail is set at $750,000. Cash or surety." The irony hit the room like a physical blow. It was the precise value of Adeline's life insurance policy. Eloise collapsed into her seat, her face a mask of shattered glass. "I don't have that, Dad. Tell them," she shrieked as the bailiffs moved in. I didn't wait for the gavel to hit the sound block. I stood up and turned my back on the woman I used to call my daughter, walking toward the exit while she was still being led away to a cell she couldn't buy her way out of. As I stepped past the heavy oak doors and into the hallway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a call from Jennifer, but it was a text from Nurse Joyce. "Adeline is awake. She's asking for Eloise." My world tilted on its axis. I burst through the ICU doors, still smelling of the courthouse stale coffee and cold justice, only to find the one thing I wasn't prepared for: the light finally returning to Adeline's eyes. My tires had shrieked against the asphalt of the parking lot as I raced back to Charlotte General. My mind, a blurring collision of the orange jumpsuit I'd just left behind and the woman I'd prayed to see wake for weeks. When I reached her bedside, she was propped up against the pillows, her face pale, but her gaze focused. "Vance," she asked, her voice a thin, raspy thread that snagged on my heart. "Why is it so bright in here? Where is Eloise? She was supposed to meet me for lunch." She was talking about a lunch from 7 months ago. I reached for her hand, my skin feeling rough and calloused against hers, which still carried the faint scent of hospital soap and antiseptic. "Addie, take it slow," I whispered, trying to keep my voice from cracking like sun-baked timber. You have been asleep for a while. She looked at me with a confused, soft smile, then mentioned that she'd secretly given Eloise a second set of keys to my private workshop back in the spring. She thought it would help us bond over my old blueprints. The revelation was a fresh puncture wound. Eloise hadn't broken into my files she'd been invited in by the very woman she intended to kill. Amnesia isn't a blank slate. It's a structural bypass. Her mind had built a bridge over the truth because the truth was a drop too steep to survive. Doctor, Aris stepped into the room, his expression a mixture of professional triumph and clinical caution. He explained the retrograde amnesia, the lost months, that coincidentally covered every moment of Eloise's escalating theft. To my wife, our daughter was still the perfect, devoted girl who brought her lavender lattes and shared secrets. She wouldn't just leave me here. Vance Adeline insisted, her voice gaining a frantic, sharp edge. Did you say something to her? Did you two have another fight about her business? She looked at me not with love, but with a growing suspicion that I was the one standing in the way of her happiness. It's not a fight, Addie. It is a criminal case. I said the words, feeling heavy and wrong in the sterile air. Liar. That word coming from Adeline's lips felt sharper than any shard of glass on Highway 74. She began to struggle against the translucent tubes tethering her to the monitors. You are lying. You have always been too hard on her. You're jealous because she's successful. Get out, I want my daughter. The machines began to wail a chorus of electronic panic as her heart rate spiked on the monitor. I tried to reach for her to show her the bank records I carried in my pocket, but she recoiled as if my touch was poison. I want Beckett. She screamed, her face flushed a dangerous red. He's the only honest one, call Beckett. She had no idea he was the one who had already traded her life for a reduced sentence. The nurses swarmed the bed, their blue scrubs a blur of motion as they moved to sedate her. As they pushed me toward the door, Adeline's voice followed me into the hall, raw and desperate. I know my daughter Vance. She would never hurt me. I stood in the corridor, the silence of the hospital settling over me like a shroud, and I knew there was only one way left to save her. I had to show her the practice sheets. A bridge doesn't just fall. It screams before the steel snaps, and as I walked back toward Adeline's room with the evidence in my hand, I could already hear the sound of her world tearing apart. I sat for a moment in the hospital cafeteria, my fingers white-knuckled around the manila folder that contained the death of her illusions. The tea in front of me had gone cold, as stagnant as the air in this building. I knew that what I was about to do would be more invasive than any of the surgeries Adeline had endured, but leaving the cancer of Eloise's lies in her mind was a risk I could no longer take. I met Basil Redmond in the hallway just outside the ICU. He gave me a curt nod, his old man charm already deployed, as he leaned against the nurse's station, regaling the young staff with a convoluted story about his hardware store days. It was the perfect screen. I slipped past the station and into Adeline's room. She was sitting up, her eyes red-rimmed and fixed on the door, still searching for the daughter who was currently being fingerprinted in a county jail cell. I am not here to argue anymore, Addie. I said, my voice as unwavering as a support beam. I am here to show you the truth. She started to turn away, the old defiance flickering in her gaze, but I moved faster. I spread the practice forgery sheets across her lap. Ink. Rows and rows of it. A daughter's love expressed in the calligraphy of a crime. I pointed to the slant of the A in her name, written hundreds of times in Eloise's sharp, distinctive cursive. I showed her the tablet Eloise had gifted her for her birthday, explaining how the digital trail proved it was a Trojan horse, used to mirror her banking apps and track her movements. Adeline's breath hitched. She was practicing. She whispered, her fingers hovering over the paper as if it might burn her. Like a school assignment, denial is a sturdy wall, but once the first brick is pulled, The whole structure becomes a landslide. I watched the dust settle in her eyes. I laid out the bank statements next the six-figure transfers, and finally the forged life insurance policy, where her signature was a dead static mimicry of her own hand. Adeline traced the ink with a trembling finger, her touchlight on the paper. I watched as her face shifted from confusion to a hollowed-out horror that made her look smaller than I had ever seen her. The realization of the premeditation hit her like a physical blow. She found a note I had almost missed, a draft from Eloise to a real estate agent, describing Adeline's failing health as a reason to expedite our home sale, written 3 months before the car ever left the road. She didn't love me, Vance. She whispered, her voice like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. She was just waiting for me to be worth more dead than alive. She didn't scream or fight this time. She simply began to shake, a silent structural collapse that signaled the end of our family as we knew it. Adeline pushed the papers away, her face a mask of gray stone. "Call the attorney, Vance," she whispered. "I want to sign the restraining order. And then, I want to hear the 40-second call." I took her hand, the weight of the truth finally shared, and felt the first cold breeze of a winter that would never end. The phone didn't just ring. It screamed a high-pitched digital demand that sliced through the midnight silence of a house that finally knew the truth. I stood in my dark kitchen, the only light coming from the glowing rectangle on the counter. The caller ID read Mecklenburg County Jail. I stared at it, my pulse steady for the first time in weeks. I thought about the 41 calls I had ignored, while Adeline was fighting for her breath in the ICU. I remembered the coldness of the hospital bills and the surgical precision of the forged signatures I'd found in my own office. This wasn't just a phone call. It was the final inspection of a bridge that had already collapsed into the river. "One last time, Eloise," I whispered to the empty room. "Let us see what $1 million is worth to you now." I reached out and tapped the screen, accepting the charges. "Dad, oh thank God." Her voice was frantic, stripped of every ounce of that designer poise she'd worn like a second skin. "You have to get me out of here, Vance. It is disgusting, and the women in here are animals. My lawyer said, you have the insurance money, use it. I want to go home." I felt a wave of nausea so strong it tasted like copper. "The insurance money?" I asked, my voice as flat as a Carolina plane. "You mean the $750,000 you tried to collect while your mother was still breathing?" Eloise didn't even pause. She actually told me she felt relieved the Tesla had been seized because the payout on Adeline would have upgraded her to a better model anyway. 31. A number that represents every time she chose her own comfort over her mother's survival. Before I let you hear what I heard in her next sentence, are you still holding on to this story? Comment, choose A if you think I should hang up, or B if I should keep listening, and add one word for what you're feeling. A quick note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. 42 calls, Eloise, I said, cutting through her excuses. Not once did you ask if she woke up. Not once did you ask if she could speak. You didn't even ask if her heart was still beating. I was stressed. "Dad, I am the victim here," she shrieked. I realized then that the structural failure was total. There was no empathy left in the woman who shared my DNA. Hanging up that phone felt like cutting the final cable on a bridge that was already underwater. "Adeline is awake," I told her, and the silence on the other end was absolute. "She has seen the forgery sheets. She is the one who signed the restraining order. I am not your father anymore, Eloise. I'm just a witness." I hung up the phone and blocked the number, the weight finally leaving my chest. I set the device on the counter and watched the screen go dark. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I had heard in years. Eloise was gone, and now I had to prepare for the man who was going to help me bury her legally, Beckett Madden. I knew I was recording the whole thing, and her admission of motive was the final nail in her coffin. I walked into the law firm with a steady hand and a clear head, carrying the recording of last night's call like a finishing tool for a job that had taken far too long to complete. The silence of the counter and the dark kitchen were behind me, now replaced by the humming efficiency of Jennifer Caldwell's office. I sat across from her, my briefcase resting on my knees, feeling like a man who had finally located the terminal stress point in a failing structure. Jennifer looked up from a thick stack of documents, her expression one of grim satisfaction. "Beckett Madden has officially signed a cooperation agreement," she said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, legal certainty. He flipped faster than a rusted bridge beam under a heavy load Vance. He wasn't protecting her. He was just waiting for the right price to sell her out. Facing 45 years for his role in the insurance fraud and brake sabotage, my son-in-law had traded Eloise's freedom for his own. He had handed over a hidden cloud storage password containing months of recorded arguments and planning sessions. A rat will always leave a sinking ship, but Beckett didn't just jump. He chewed through the hull on his way out to make sure Eloise went down with the wreck. Beckett's statement revealed that the car crash on Highway 74 wasn't her first attempt. She had actually begun practicing small-scale sabotage on my own truck months prior to ensure she knew exactly how to make it look like a mechanical fluke. Jennifer turned her monitor toward me and pressed play on a recovered audio file from August 12th. Eloise's voice filled the room, laughing as she spoke to Beckett. "The old man is too blind to see the rust I am putting in his life." She had said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing a kitchen renovation. "I can't wait 30 years for an inheritance, Beckett. Nature needs a little push." I sat perfectly still, my skin crawling. "That is my daughter talking about killing her mother." She explicitly detailed using the insurance payout to settle Beckett's gambling debts and fund her firm's expansion. Tight. The most beautiful word in an inspector's vocabulary. No cracks, no leaks, no escape. The attorney explained that this testimony, combined with the forensic recordings and the 42 call logs I had provided, made the case unwinnable for the defense. Eloise had even picked out a memorial garden for Adeline before the crash happened, using the design as a pitch to show prospective investors how her brand honored legacy. It was a level of sociopathic planning that exceeded even my darkest suspicions. "This is it," Vance Jennifer said, closing the file with a definitive thud. "We have the motive, the method, and now the confession." "Build the case," I replied, my voice as flat as a Carolina plain. "I want it airtight. I want her to never see the sun as a free woman again." I gave the formal approval to proceed to the grand jury, realizing the structural failure of her marriage was the one thing she hadn't accounted for in her blueprints of betrayal. I walked out of Jennifer's office and felt the first true breeze of the fall. The trap was set. The evidence was undeniable. But as I headed toward my car to tell Adeline the news, my phone buzzed with an alert from a private investigator Basil had hired on the side. I looked at the name on the screen and felt my heart skip a beat. The smell of roasting turkey used to be a warning sign in this house, a precursor to Eloise's complaints about the table setting or her subtle jabs at our modest lifestyle. But this year, the air just smelled like home. I stood in my kitchen in Matthews, North Carolina, watching the steam rise from a pot of mashed potatoes, feeling a quietude I hadn't known in decades. The frantic energy that used to accompany her arrival was gone, replaced by a steady, rhythmic peace. Adeline was beside me, walking with a cane now, but steady on her feet, her eyes bright and clear of the fog that had nearly claimed her. She was humming as she helped with the stuffing, her movements slow but deliberate. "You know, Vance, the silence doesn't feel lonely today," she said, pausing to look out the window at the autumn leaves. "It feels clean." I nodded, squeezing her shoulder. "It is the lack of friction, Addie. The bridge isn't vibrating anymore." Last year, Eloise had spent this day borrowing our credit card for a designer splurge, while claiming she was too busy to even set the table. This year, the house felt structurally lighter, freed from the weight of her terminal entitlement. Loose. That's how my chest felt for the first time in a decade. No tightness, no waiting for the next disaster to drop from her lips. Jennifer Caldwell had shared a disturbing update earlier. Eloise had attempted to send a Thanksgiving card from jail that was actually a coded message to hide secondary assets. Even behind bars, she was still trying to manage her blueprints of greed. By 2 p.m., our chosen family began to arrive. Basil Redmond walked in, first carrying a bottle of high-end cider and a grin that could light up a dark tunnel. Nurse Joyce, who had become a regular weekend visitor and a true confidant to Adeline, followed close behind. Jennifer Caldwell joined us shortly after shedding her attorney persona for the warmth of a friend. This new circle of loyalty stood in stark contrast to the transactional relationships Eloise had curated. Basil pulled me aside to mention the PI's findings. Eloise was currently trying to design her jail cell with contraband, apparently refusing to accept a reality that didn't involve silk and marble. Family isn't always a foundation you are born with. Sometimes it is a retrofit, adding new supports to an old house until it can finally stand on its own. We sat down in the dining room, the table filled with food and the sound of genuine laughter. I looked at the empty space where Eloise used to sit. I didn't feel grief, only a clinical sense of relief that the rot had finally been excised. I realized that while I had lost a daughter of blood, I had gained a village of steel. Adeline revealed she had spent the morning setting up a small trust fund for Joyce's children, using the first bit of our recovered funds to pay back the kindness that had saved her life. "We aren't looking back today," I said, raising my glass for a toast. "We are looking at who is at the table right now." As the laughter around the table rose, Jennifer leaned in and whispered to me, "Enjoy the peace, Vance. Tomorrow morning we start the mock trials. The prosecution is ready to play the 42 calls for the jury." I felt a chill, but I didn't shake. The foundation was set. I thought I had drained every drop of grief out of my system in that ICU waiting room. But as the courtroom doors locked with a heavy metallic click, I realized that some ghosts only scream when they're put on the public record. The harsh fluorescent lights of the prosecutor's office from the previous Monday were nothing compared to the cold, cavernous judgment of courtroom 1856. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my fingers intertwined so tightly they felt like a single piece of fused bone. The bailiff called the court to order, and the air in the room became pressurized, heavy with the weight of impending justice. Prosecutor Rachel stood with the posture of someone who had already seen the end of the world and survived it. She delivered a blistering opening statement, framing the case as a calculated assassination of family trust. She introduced the 42 calls motif, explaining how Eloise used the jail's communication system not to seek forgiveness, but to further her extortion. I watched my daughter at the defense table. She was dressed in a conservative navy suit, trying to mimic a professional persona that had long since rotted away. One of the early calls played during the opening revealed Eloise attempting to coach Beckett on how to accidentally delete our home office backup server while I was still at the hospital. She wasn't looking for a family, Rachel told the jury. She was looking for a payout. Detective West was called to the stand to authenticate the recordings. As the first 10 calls played, I felt a familiar nausea. Eloise's voice filled the room, not sobbing or broken, but demanding and shrill. She complained about the thread count of the jail blankets and the quality of the water. Vitamins. She was worried about her skin regimen and demanded Beckett find her designer supplements while the woman who gave her life was being kept alive by a machine. The contrast was so sharp, it felt like a blade. Have you ever heard your own voice break over a PA system? It sounds like the structural failure of a man's entire belief system broadcast in high definition. The prosecution saved the final set of calls for the end of the morning session. The courtroom fell into a pin-drop silence as my own recorded voice finally answered the 42nd attempt. The raw pain of that midnight confrontation echoed through the speakers, filling every corner of the room. "Did you ever ask if Mom was alive?" the speakers blared. "Did you ever ask if she could breathe?" Several jurors were visibly crying, wiping their eyes with crumpled tissues. "I'm not your father anymore. Goodbye, Eloise." The audio revealed a 30-second ghost call she tried to make to a private investigator to track my movements after I hung up, proving the hunt never stopped. As the audio died out, the lead juror looked directly at Eloise with a look of such visceral loathing that I knew the trial was already over in their minds. Her mask of composure finally shattered, not into tears, but into a scowl of pure narcissistic rage. She leaned over and whispered something into her lawyer's ear that made the man turn pale, his eyes darting toward me with a sudden sharp fear. "The state calls Vance Sinclair," Rachel announced. I stood up my legs, feeling like lead pipes, and moved toward the witness stand to finish what I had started. The witness stand is a lonely place, a small island of wood and Bible-sworn truth, surrounded by a sea of people waiting to see if you'll sink or swim under the weight of your own tragedy. My hand trembled slightly as I placed it on the Bible to take the oath, the leather cool and worn under my palm. I looked up and scanned the jury box. A retired teacher in the front row was clutching her tissues, her face a map of empathy, while a young man in the back stared at Eloise with a look of pure clinical judgment. The atmosphere was thick with the residue of the recordings they had just heard. It felt like a bridge undergoing a final terminal stress test. I realized then that I didn't need to be an avenger. I just needed to be the inspector who points out the rot. I took my seat and looked toward the defense table. "They see you now, Eloise," I thought. "No amount of Italian wool can hide the structural failure of your soul." As I began my testimony, my eyes caught a glint of white gold at her ears. She was wearing Adeline's vintage pearl earrings, the ones my wife only wore for anniversaries. She must have stolen them during her last visit before the arrest. It was one more small, jagged theft in a lifetime of them. During my direct examination, Eloise didn't show an ounce of fear. Instead, she sighed loudly and rolled her eyes as I described the long nights I spent by Adeline's bedside in the ICU. She whispered to her lawyer, a smirk dancing on her lips that suggested she found the entire proceeding beneath her dignity. Her entitlement was a physical presence in the room, clashing violently with the emotional wreckage the jury had just endured. Have you ever seen a mask shatter? It doesn't break into clean pieces. It splinters into something jagged and dangerous. The prosecutor asked me to describe the moment I discovered the folder labeled "Final Transition." I spoke about the nursing home brochure and the spreadsheets that priced out our lives like scrap metal. "Dad, stop being so dramatic," Eloise hissed from the table. "Order. Defendant will remain silent." Judge Miller barked his gavel, striking with a sharp crack. But the dam had already burst. Eloise finally snapped. She stood up, her face contorting into a mask of narcissistic fury. "It was a 5-star facility, you ungrateful old man," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I was fixing your mess. I was providing you a lifestyle you were too unrefined to appreciate." In those 30 seconds, she confirmed every accusation. She actually argued about the quality of the prison she'd chosen for me. That was her love. The courtroom fell into a stunned, horrified silence as she inadvertently revealed she had already paid a non-refundable deposit to Sunset Pines using the money stolen from our equity line. 5-star. She had institutionalized our future before the brakes even failed. Eloise sank back into her chair, her chest heaving while the lead juror scribbled a single word on his notepad, in letters so large I could see the ink from the stand. The trial wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a sentencing. I sat there unwavering, watching the dust of her reputation settle. But then the defense attorney stood up for cross-examination, his expression shifting into a shark-like grin. He was holding a grainy sepia-toned photo I hadn't seen in years, and the air in the room suddenly turned very cold. Mr. Thorne didn't just walk toward the stand. He circled it like a shark that had scented a crack in a deep-sea cable, holding a glossy 10 by 12 photo like a jagged piece of shrapnel. I sat on the witness stand, my hands resting flat on the railing, watching the defense lead approach. Mr. Thorne, the defense lead with a suit that cost more than a small car, and a smile that never quite reached his predatory eyes, leaned over the witness rail. He slapped the photograph down in front of me. I recognized it instantly, the 2018 bypass collapse. It was a file I kept in my private workshop, a reminder of the one professional scar I carried. I realized then that Beckett Madden must have stolen this during one of our bonding visits, a calculated theft intended to weaponize my own history against me. "You are an expert at missing the signs of structural collapse, aren't you, Mr. Sinclair?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You inspected this span weeks before it fell, yet you found nothing. Is it possible your accusations against your daughter are just another example of you missing the truth until it is too late to save face?" I looked at the image, then up at the jury. "I follow the data, Mr. Thorne." I replied, my voice calm and low. "Even when it hurts, steel is honest. It moans when it's tired, and it snaps when it's broken. People, they just smile and keep tightening the bolts until you're crushed under the weight of their expectations." I leaned into the microphone, the silence in the courtroom so absolute. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. A bridge is easy to inspect because it doesn't have a soul or the ability to lie to your face. It doesn't pretend to love you while it is failing. I spent 40 years looking for cracks in concrete. I didn't think I had to look for them in my own daughter's heart. Eloise used my own methodology against me, hiding the rust behind a facade of success and designer wool. I failed. There. I said it. The inspector missed the biggest collapse of his career because he was too busy loving the ruin. I addressed the jury directly, my gaze steady. I failed my parenting audit. I saw the entitlement and the greed years ago, but I chose to patch the cracks with money and silence because I wanted to believe the structure was sound. I let the rot spread until the whole family came down, but I'm not missing it now. I looked back at the photo Thorne had presented. Interestingly, Mr. Thorne, this bypass failed because of a fraudulent notary who certified the substandard steel, a man named Marcus Webb. The same Marcus Webb who notarized my daughter's forged documents. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Mr. Thorne's face went from a shark's grin to the pallor of a dead fish as I mentioned Marcus Webb. He looked back at Eloise, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the back of the courtroom, where the doors were opening for the one person she never expected to see, in a wheelchair, her mother. The rhythmic squeak of the wheelchair was the only sound in the room, a slow, clinical march that felt like the ticking of a clock, counting down the seconds of Eloise's freedom. I stood by the witness rail, my heart performing a heavy, uneven cadence against my ribs. Adeline was being wheeled down the center aisle by Nurse Joyce, and as she passed the gallery, a profound hush settled over the room. She looked frail, her skin still carrying the translucent pallor of hospital lighting, but her eyes held a terrifying motherly clarity that I hadn't seen since before the brakes failed. With the help of the bailiff and my own steadying hands, Adeline was transferred to the witness stand. "I can stand, Vance," she whispered, her fingers gripping my forearm with surprising strength. "I want her to see me standing." I stepped back, nodding. "Take your time, Addie. The whole world is waiting." The jury leaned in the shift, from my technical inspections to her physical presence, making the courtroom feel oxygen-deprived. She revealed then that she had actually regained her memory weeks earlier than she told the doctors, using that silent time to privately review every bank statement with Jennifer to ensure her testimony was a cage with no exits. Adeline spoke about the morning of the crash, her voice a quiet, hollowed-out grief that was more devastating than any scream. She described the feel of the brake pedal sinking uselessly to the floor and the memory of Eloise kissing her cheek just an hour before. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound of her wheelchair was a metronome for a daughter's ending. She knew I was going to the store, Adeline said, looking at the court reporter. She knew that hill on Highway 74. She even checked my seatbelt. I thought she was being protective. I didn't know she was making sure I stayed in the seat for the impact. How much is a mother's life worth in Charlotte real estate? Apparently about 3 bedrooms and a gourmet kitchen. Before I explain what that number truly means, are you still with me? Comment A if you think she should forgive, or B if she should show no mercy, and tell me why. Please note the next part contains some recreated details for narrative purposes. The message is what I hope stays with you. Prosecutor Rachel presented the records for the $120,000 condo down payment. Adeline looked directly at Eloise, not with hate, but with a cold, clinical curiosity. Tell me, Eloise, was the master suite worth the 2 months I spent in a coma, she asked. Was the view of the city worth the sound of my ventilator? Eloise tried to look away, her face flushing a deep, mottled red. I did it for the firm, she shrieked, her voice cracking. You don't understand the pressure. Adeline didn't blink. She slowly produced a small, crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. It was a handwritten note Eloise had left in the ICU during one of those private visits, threatening to pull the plug if Adeline ever woke up and talked. As Adeline held up the threatening note, the defense table erupted into a panicked huddle. But I was focused on Eloise's face. The narcissism was finally gone, replaced by the wide-eyed animal terror of a person who realizes the cage door has finally locked from the outside. There is a finality to the way a bailiff calls a room to order that reminds me of the last bolt being driven into a bridge's main span. Once it is in, the structure is set for better or for worse. I sat in the front row of the gallery, my hand tightly interlaced with Adeline's. Her palm was warm, a living, breathing testament to the failure of Eloise's blueprints. The jury had been out for 6 hours, a span of time that felt like 6 years. But as they filed back into the box, I saw the lead jurors' eyes. They didn't look at the defense table. They looked at Adeline. The foreman stood clearing his throat into a silence so thick it felt pressurized. On the count of attempted first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word fell like a heavy stone into a deep pool. Guilty on all 7 counts. I felt Adeline's grip tighten until it was almost painful. It is over, Vance. She whispered, her voice a fragile but unbroken thread. The bridge finally held. Eloise sat perfectly still, her designer suit suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. Her face was a mask of shock as the legal reality finally overrode her narcissistic delusions. As she was being led away in handcuffs, she tried to lunge toward Adeline, her lips forming a frantic, silent plea for one last manipulation. A deputy stepped between them, physically enforcing the restraining order and marking the first time in her life that she could not claw her way into her mother's space. Judge Miller didn't hesitate during the sentencing phase. He spoke of the calculating, predatory nature of the crime, his voice echoing off the high marble walls. 45 years, he announced, the gavel striking the wood with the sound of a closing cell door. You used your intelligence to build a cage for your parents. Now you will live in one built by the state. 45. A lifetime. The exact amount of time it takes for a legacy to turn to dust. Eloise finally broke, but not in remorse. She screamed about the unfairness of the system and how she was an artist, an entrepreneur meant for greatness. I watched as she was led through the side door, her voice fading into the bowels of the courthouse until there was nothing left but the hum of the air conditioner. I helped Adeline out of her seat, my movements slow and careful. We declined to give a statement to the press, walking past the flashing cameras in a shared, dignified silence. The sun was too bright, the air too cold, and the world too loud. It was the most beautiful day I had ever seen. We reached the courthouse steps and stopped for a moment to breathe the crisp November air. I reached into my pocket and found a small, forgotten drawing Eloise had made as a child, a crude, colorful sketch of a bridge. I looked at it for a heartbeat, then left it on the courtroom bench as we walked away. It was my final release of the daughter I thought I knew. "Where to now?" Vance Adeline asked, her eyes finding mine. "Home, Addie," I replied, the word feeling structurally sound for the first time in a year. Just home. I gripped her hand as we reached the bottom step, the metal of her wedding ring cold against my palm. We were bankrupt, we were scarred, and we were older. But a bridge doesn't just connect 2 points. It survives the weight of what passes over it. I didn't reach for my toolbox to fix a leak or a squeaky hinge. I reached for it because it was time to perform a controlled demolition on the memory of the woman who nearly buried us. A week had passed since the heavy thud of the gavel signaled the end of the trial. But standing in the foyer of our home in Matthews, I could still feel the stagnant energy of Eloise's betrayal clinging to the walls like soot. Adeline stood beside me, her hand resting on the banister, her gaze fixed on the guest room door. That was the room Eloise had turned into her personal sanctuary, a space filled with items we now knew were bought with our own hijacked savings. Every time I look at that vanity, I see her practicing her signature. Vance Adeline said, her voice quiet but devoid of the old tremor. "Then the vanity goes first," I replied, gripping the handle of my pry bar. "We are reclaiming the square footage." As I began to disassemble the heavy oak piece, I found a floorboard Eloise had loosened near the corner. Taped to the underside was a spare key to the local safe deposit box I thought was secured. She had been planning one last sweep before the crash. The level of premeditated parasitism was breathtaking, yet I felt a strange clinical efficiency as I worked as if I were removing asbestos from a basement. Stripped, the room looked bigger without the lies. It looked honest. We spent the afternoon bagging up the remnants of her high society life. Her designer clothes, her abandoned sketchbooks, and the silk scarves were piled into black contractor bags. Adeline found hidden credit card statements tucked deep in the closet, more paper trails of the long con. "These silk scarves could pay for a month of groceries for a family at the shelter," Addie said, smoothing a piece of blue fabric. "Better they do some good now." "Pack them up," I said. "I want this room empty by sunset." We worked in a rhythmic, dignified silence, stripping away the designer wallpaper she had insisted on, a cold, metallic gray that had always felt like a tomb. Underneath a loose drawer liner, Adeline uncovered a box of old photos of us from 40 years ago that Eloise had hidden away. I realized then that she hadn't just wanted our money. She wanted to remove our history to make her new version of us easier to control. Painting over a mistake doesn't make it disappear, but it ensures you don't have to stare at the structural cracks every time you wake up. By evening, we had begun applying a fresh coat of warm, soft cream paint to the walls. The smell of fresh latex and hope slowly replaced the lingering scent of her expensive, cloying perfume. As the rollers covered the old marks on the drywall, the room began to transform from a monument of narcissism into a blank canvas for our future. It is amazing how much light a simple coat of paint can bring back into a house, Adeline remarked, her face illuminated by the work lamp. "It is not just the paint, Addie," I said, looking around the bare, clean space. "It is the lack of shadows." I stood in the center of the empty room and realized that while the purge was done, the house still felt a little too quiet. And then Adeline walked in, holding a seed catalog and a set of architectural sketches for a new greenhouse. She wasn't just fixing the house. She was planning to grow something new. The mail carrier didn't know he was delivering a ghost when he slid the yellow envelope with the prison return address into our box, but the weight of it nearly took my arm off. I stood at the end of the driveway in the biting December air, staring at the stamp from the North Carolina Department of Adult Correction. It was 3 days before Christmas. I didn't take it into the house. I walked straight to my workshop, the scent of fresh cedar sawdust from the greenhouse project acting as a buffer against the stagnant rot I knew was inside that paper. I sat at my workbench and pulled out 12 pages of lined prison stationery. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, sharp, aggressive, and perfectly slanted. The tone was a jarring mixture of faux remorse and entitlement. "Dear Daddy, I know you're hurting, but the system is the real criminal here," she wrote. She used childhood nicknames I hadn't heard in 20 years, trying to find a structural weakness in my resolve. She wanted me to fund an appeal, claiming she was a victim of a biased jury and a spineless husband. Inside the prison envelope, she had even included a pre-written forgiveness statement for me to sign and send to the parole board. She was still trying to manage my reality from a 6x9 cell. "You haven't changed a bit, Eloise," I whispered to the empty workshop. "Still trying to sell the same rotten wood." Adeline joined me a few minutes later, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the concrete floor. She saw the yellow envelope and stopped. I offered her the letter, but she stepped back, her hands tucked into her cardigan pockets. She refused to even touch the paper. "Do you want to know what she said?" I asked. Adeline looked at the heavy-duty industrial shredder bolted to the end of my bench. "No. I want to know what is for dinner," she replied, her voice firm. "Feed it to the machines, Vance. Grind. Whir. Silence." 12 pages of manipulation reduced to 5 ounces of waste paper. We stood together and watched the blades consume the lies, turning her demands into useless confetti. I realized then that by shredding the letter without a single word of reply, I had exercised the ultimate power. I had made her irrelevant. Christmas Eve arrived at our house with a quiet dignity we hadn't felt in a decade. There were no $500 centerpieces or performative designer gifts cluttering the foyer. Instead, we decorated the tree with old, mismatched ornaments we thought were lost in the back of the attic. We ate a simple meal of pot roast with Basil, the three of us laughing about old hardware store stories that had nothing to do with courtrooms or bank accounts. Christmas isn't a gala. It's a structural support. It's the people who stay when the walls start to shake. "This is the first time in 10 years I haven't had a headache on Christmas Eve," Basil remarked, raising a glass of cider. "That's because there's no more poison in the well, Basil," I said. The house felt sturdy, the foundation finally settled after the demolition. I looked at Adeline under the glow of the tree lights and saw her truly smile, not the tired, brave smile of a survivor, but the real thing. But as I went to clear the table, I noticed a small, flickering light on the security monitor in the hallway. A car was idling at the end of our driveway, its headlights cutting through the darkness like two cold, unblinking eyes. I stood on the porch with my breath hitching in the January air, realizing that the most dangerous things don't always come with a battering ram. Sometimes they arrive with a clipboard and a soft, rehearsed smile. I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the porch light switch, ready to face whatever ghost was still haunting the curb. The headlights of the idling sedan finally cut, and a woman stepped out. Sarah Jenkins, a woman in her late 30s with a soft knit cardigan and a binder full of healing infographics, stood on the porch, looking like a missionary for a religion I didn't believe in. She was a court-mandated social worker representing a state-funded restorative justice initiative. "We believe that confronting the harm can lead to restorative outcomes for both the victim and the offender," she said, her voice dripping with a practiced professional empathy. Sarah revealed that Eloise herself had initiated the request, hoping a reconciliation would look good on her first parole hearing in 10 years. "My daughter didn't just cause harm, Ms. Jenkins," I replied, my voice as cold as the frost on the railing. "She engineered a collapse. You don't restore a bridge that was built to fail. You clear the debris. Restorative. A beautiful word for a dangerous lie. You don't restore a cancer. You cut it out. I invited her into the living room only because the wind had picked up. Adeline joined us, her movements slow, but her presence unyielding. She listened to the pitch for mediated letters and face-to-face meetings with a clinical silence. When Sarah finished, Adeline didn't hesitate. "I spent 40 years being a mother," she said. "I don't need a certificate of closure from the state to know I am done. Please tell the Department of Corrections that our boundary is made of reinforced concrete." We officially declined the program, choosing a future where Eloise was a closed chapter rather than a recurring character. I escorted Sarah to her car, feeling the structural integrity of my home strengthen with every step. Once the door was locked, I went to the home office to call Jennifer Caldwell. We spent the next hour reviewing the final seizure reports from the liquidation of Eloise's design firm and her luxury condo. Between the forced sales and the clawed-back insurance funds, we had recovered 80% of our original savings. 80%, Vance Jennifer said over the speakerphone. It is a miracle in these types of fraud cases. It is not a miracle, Jennifer, I countered. It is a recovery. We're rebuilding the foundation $1 at a time. 80% isn't a perfect bridge, but it's enough to carry the load. We can work with 80%. I discovered that the total included a significant sum from an offshore account Eloise thought was untraceable, proving the forensic audit had been more thorough than her theft. We were safe. We were solvent. The parasite had been purged, and the resources she tried to bleed dry were finally flowing back into the bedrock of our lives. I closed the laptop and looked at the final balance, the numbers glowing like a promise. But as I looked at Adeline, I saw her holding a small silver key I hadn't seen before, one that didn't belong to any lock in this house. She was turning it over in her fingers, her expression a mixture of secret relief and quiet sorrow. I watched the light catch the teeth of the silver key, wondering how many more doors we had to open before we were truly free. In 40 years of bridge inspection, I had learned that the smallest components, a single bolt, a hairline fracture, a silver key, are often the ones that determine if a structure stands or falls. I sat in our reclaimed living room, watching the winter light catch the jagged teeth of the small silver object Adeline held. Where did this come from? I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet house. Adeline smiled, a soft, secret expression that reached her eyes. She revealed she had kept the key, taped inside a 1950s cookbook Eloise frequently mocked for being outdated. Our daughter's arrogance was her own blind spot. She was so busy looking for digital treasures that she never bothered to check the physical history under her nose. Adeline explained that the key belonged to a safety deposit box she had opened in secret years ago. It contained heirloom jewelry and gold coins Eloise never knew existed. "I kept it for a rainy day, Vance," she said, her fingers tracing the metal. "I just didn't realize the rain would be a hurricane named Eloise." I felt a surge of awe. "You were performing your own safety audit while I was looking at the clouds," I said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. We realized that while Eloise was looting our digital life, the physical foundation of our heritage remained safe under Adeline's quiet watch. The phone buzzed on the coffee table, a final update from Jennifer Caldwell regarding Beckett Madden's sentencing. Because he had cooperated and provided the recordings that buried Eloise, the judge handed him a reduced sentence. 10 years. Long enough for a man to think about every bolt he didn't tighten. I felt a clinical sense of closure. The man who enabled the rot was finally accounted for, leaving no loose ends in the structural integrity of our new life. "Let him go," I told Jennifer. "He was just a secondary support that failed under pressure. He is irrelevant now." Adeline then led me into the new hobby room, the smell of fresh cream paint still faint in the air. She unveiled her final project, using a portion of the recovered 80% of our savings to fund the Adeline Sinclair Community Library. She showed me the architectural sketches for the renovated space, a place built for truth stories and community, a library, Addie, that is a legacy that actually matters, I said, my heart swelling. A library is a bridge made of paper and ink. It carries people to places they never thought they could reach. It is a structure built to last, Vance. She replied, her hand finding mine. Just like us. I looked at the plans and felt a profound sense of peace. The project would be housed in the very downtown building Eloise had once tried to buy for her firm's expansion, a final poetic reclamation of the land she tried to steal. I performed a mental safety audit of our current state. I looked for cracks, for rot, for vulnerabilities, and for the first time in my life I found none. I looked at the blueprints for the library, and then back at my wife, realization dawning on me like a sunrise over a newly finished span. We weren't just surviving the collapse. We were the architects of something that would stand long after we were gone. The structure was sound, the cables were tight, and the view from the top was clearer than I ever imagined possible. I stood on the front porch of our house, the morning air crisp and clean, and performed one last silent inspection. The air in North Carolina on New Year's Eve carries a specific weight, not just the cold, but the heavy, lingering scent of wood smoke and the quiet promise of a slate being scrubbed clean by the frost. I looked at the driveway, remembering the car I'd seen idling there before Christmas. It hadn't been a ghost or a threat, but Basil Redmond. He had left a package on the porch, a framed photo of the original bridge blueprints I drew 40 years ago. It was a return to my true self, a reminder that I was built to create things that lasted, not just to watch them fall. I walked back inside and joined Adeline on the back deck. We sat in cedar Adirondack chairs wrapped in heavy wool blankets, watching the first frost settle on the yard. We looked out over the area where the new greenhouse would soon stand, discussing the quietude of our reclaimed life. I realized that the most resilient bridges aren't the ones that never crack, but the ones that are rebuilt with better materials after a total collapse. We survived the stress test, Addie, I said, reaching out to take her hand. The load is finally gone. She squeezed my fingers, looking up at the sky. I don't think I've ever seen the stars look this sharp, Vance. Or maybe I'm just finally looking up instead of at my feet. 0. That's the amount of leverage she has left. A perfect, beautiful circle of nothing. At 11:45 p.m., my phone vibrated in my pocket. A final automated notification of a rejected call from the correctional facility. It was the last ghost of the year trying to find a way back into the house. I looked at the screen, seeing the familiar sequence of numbers, and felt absolutely nothing. No rage, no pity, just the clinical observation of a dead signal. Still calling, even at the end of the world, I remarked. Adeline didn't even look over. Let it ring out into the cold, Vance. There is no one here to pick up anymore. Time is the ultimate inspector. It wears down the weak and polishes the strong until only the truth is left standing in the morning light. The clock struck midnight in the distance, signaled by a few stray fireworks from the neighbors that blossomed like fireflowers over the tree line. I took my phone, navigated to the settings, and permanently deactivated the line associated with the jail calls, effectively cutting the last digital wire. I found a final unread text from Beckett Madden sent from his processing center. She never deserved you. I deleted it without a second thought. Silence was the only power I needed now. I poured 2 glasses of sparkling cider, and we shared a quiet toast, looking toward the dark yard, where the library blueprints would soon become a reality in the spring sunshine. Happy New Year, Addie. The audit is complete. To the New Year, Vance, she replied, her eyes reflecting the porch light. To a house that finally stands on its own. I slid the phone into my pocket, the screen dark, and the connection severed forever. I looked at Adeline, took her hand, and walked back into the house, closing the door on the past, with the steady, certain click of a lock that was finally truly secure. Looking back at this family story, I see my greatest failure wasn't missing the forged signatures. It was ignoring the early cracks in my own home. I spent decades inspecting bridges, but I refused to inspect character. This family story taught me that love without accountability becomes blindness. Don't be like me. Don't confuse silence with peace or generosity with good parenting. When the warning signs appear, document them. Address them. Truth may hurt, but denial destroys. Many people call what I did dad revenge, but if I'm honest, dad revenge was never about punishment, it was about protection. It was the moment I stopped being naive and started being responsible. Still, I regret that it had to come to that. In this family story, I learned that boundaries are not cruelty. They are structure. And real dad revenge is simply choosing justice over fear. Even so, no father dreams of standing in court against his own child. If there's one lesson I carry forward, it's this: integrity must be audited just like finances. Trust, but verify. And when everything collapsed, I believe God allowed the exposure not to destroy us, but to rebuild us stronger. Faith didn't remove the storm, it steadied my hands while I rebuilt after the family story fell apart. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you were placed in Vance's position, or faced a betrayal that severe your perspective matters to me? If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories. A gentle note: while inspired by real-world themes of financial exploitation and family conflict, certain elements have been dramatized for narrative depth. If this topic isn't for you, feel free to explore other stories that better match your interests.